Manipravala Kavyas, Sandesha Kavyas, etc. I mean, don't you think that they also have to be consulted if we have to get a proper, full picture of sexuality, relations, sexual relations and all that in Kerala during that period?
Yeah. So that's a very, very important question. But I mean, so as you know, so there is a time constraint, and also there is a so time constraint particularly. So so as MG was asking, so I mean, we also have literatures coming in other language. I mean, sorry, in Malayalam. Say for example, you have Achi Charitams, particularly Uni Achi Charitam, and many other Achi Charitams coming. So it's basically what you find in the 14th century. So there is a large number of public women. So emergence of public women within the Malayali culture. So and the text. I mean, who is calling them as Achis? So it's not that that the women calling themselves as Achis. It's basically someone else is calling them Achis. That means you have a public women coming up, emerging up. So then the scribal elites of this century, the 14th century, even the 15th century, you have Achi Charitam. So they said that, look, these are the people who actually create the moral disturbances in the area. So they had to be stopped. And of course, they don't particularly openly say that, they have to be stopped, but they actually created a term for itself. All right. So, when we, of course, it's very, very clear that, when we talk about these questions of the gender and sexuality and how the scribal elite, particularly the Brahmanic scribal elites and also the elite Muslim scribals in the 16th century, they definitely saw this as a problem. Not only, of course, for the Muslims, who were living and the scholars who were living in the urban area. So this public women was not so much as a problem as the women or the kind of ideas generated by generated in the garrisons and the practice generated in the garrisons and the open spaces, because they were not actually they did not start traveling into the interior by this time. And of course, these Achi Charitams are basically not emerging as urban spaces. It's basically emerging out of, I think, the rural spaces. Of course, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So, mostly. So what I'm trying to say is that, there is a moral disturbances happening in the interior itself, in the agrarian interior itself, because most of the Achis, the prostitutes, if I could call them, so they're traveling all the agrarian. So if someone reads Unnu Neeli Sandesham, for example, so you find lot of agrarian imaginaries in that. You find, as scholars of genre, the literatures, for example, Totterau would say that, so this is particularly, this is happening because there is a moral dilemma, there is a scholastic dilemma in the interior as well, and you have the new genre emerging in the 14th century and 15th century, because the elite agrarian elites were not happy with the public women, women who is questioning, women who is coming, and you also have women going to the temples. And say, for example, in Unnu Neeli Sandesham, you also have women going to the temple. So it's also very, very interesting in the present context, in the sense that Unnu Neeli is actually going to Guruvayur temple in 14th century. So you have all this kind of happening and say that, okay, these are the public women, so let us call them as such. So what I'm trying to say is that, of course, going along with MGS, when we talk about gender and sexuality, it is very, very necessary that we should also take into consideration this kind of text, then we will have a larger picture. And of course, that should be a different or a longer project one should be taking care of later.
I was wondering whether there could be a counter text to the text you referred. The text you referred, the Portuguese appear as aggressors, violating the women and violating a social order. Approximately at the same time, the Mughal invasion takes place in northern India. Could be there some text which justifies, say in that context, for example, I really don't know what would have been the behavior of Mughal rulers towards the local women, and would there have been a justification to it or a opposition to it? Any sort of information you have?
To my knowledge, it's not from the same period. So you don't have indigenous writings emerging during, say, 16th century or 17th century, which is considering the Mughals as sexual violators. But what you find, say for example, so if you look at Maharashtra, so there is a 17th century text which is called written by Kavindra Paramananda, and it is Shiva Bharati text. So it was actually written in the late 17th century. So you find them, the Mughals are being kind of conceived as a political violators and moral violators. Nowhere in the text actually talks about it, the author, Kavindra Paramananda. So he actually talks about, he doesn't talk about, so the sexual violation. So what I'm trying to say is that, the Mughals were always kind of considered by the vernacular, scribal elites as a political disorder and a pietistic disorder, and of course a moral disorder. Sexual disorder, so far we have no textual evidence which tells us that the indigenous local population, the writers actually consider them as sexual violators. So we have no idea. So and of course, so the Mughal sexuality was a very, very different thing in the sense that, so you have a lot of works, say for example, Rosalinda Hanlon, Rubilal, and Audrey Truschke. So all these kind of scholars have different opinion about Mughal sexuality and how they considered women. So the latest work on this question is actually written by Rubilal, the empresses. So you have different questions asked in the Mughal harem, and so they have taken into consideration a lot of other things. So for example, so the whole things about cosmetics, the whole things about, so you also have a lot of different kind of non-believer women decorating the Mughal harem. So what I'm trying to say is that, and if they had some issues with that, so we are actually talking about a century, 16th century I would say, so a century which doesn't categorize ruler in terms of their religion per se. When there is a power, and people who are longing for power would definitely get the power through different mechanisms. So that is why Mughal harem became so enormous, because of this kind of reasons. So, but as far as the indigenous, literary resources are concerned, so we don't have something which would tells that Mughals, or even for that matter sultans, the Delhi sultans were actually considered as sexual violators. We don't have in 14th century or 15th century or 16th century. These things are of course emerging in the 18th century when the Rajputs became a kind of territorial subterranean political entity. So you have from Rajasthan, from 18th century. And by 19th century, you have enormous literatures which actually talks about them as sexual violators. Or of course, with colonial, intervention, and the kind of new cognitive process which is happening in the vernacular, scribal, and literary sphere. But in the 16th century, 17th century, to my knowledge, I don't think we have something like that.
When used to commit Jawhar, so Rajasthan was a place where they did that. So my question also was, whether this also, you can compare them to any invader, not any religious invader, but any
I think you are referring to, I'm sorry if I interrupted. So you are referring to the whole question or the story about Padmavati, for example. So, Padmavati, and of course, which ultimately became a film. Well, of course, I don't like it. So, Ramya Nabishan, who extensively worked on this question of Jawhar and Sadi and things like that. So, she would say that the whole idea of committing Sadi and things are actually emerging only in the 17th century. Of course, people were committing Sadi and Jawhar for different reasons. But Sadi and Jawhar was committing because there is an external Muslim presence in the larger sacrosanctum of the Hindu, royal culture, which was only happening in the late 17th century. Okay, so, and we know that, so the whole literary activities is actually happening much after, say, for example, Alauddin Khilji died, all right? So this literature, of course, was coming, particularly in the 18th century, particularly with the writings of, say, General Todd, a person who gave the identity to Rajputs. A colonial administrator who said that, okay, you are Kshatriyas, you have a different kind of a blood, martial blood, so you have to behave like this. So basically the whole martial sensibilities were actually created by a British administrator. Okay.
So one more thing, on a lighter note, you said the lower caste compared the Portuguese to Ravan.
Yeah.
Ravan, as per the story, was a great scholar, and he never raped Sita.
Right.
He was waiting for her consent.
Yeah.
And that is why she...
But 16th century, the picture of Ravan got really changed. So it was not...
I'm not a historian.
All right, okay.
So I'm a lawyer engineer, so I don't have... Just a small comment. In the same period, probably Columbus was doing the same thing in Latin America, was he? The Christian
The
conquest.
great Spanish
Conquest.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't find money.
Yeah.
They had to invent money for the
They found silver and they found women.
Yes, they couldn't find gold.
So there is an absolutely fantastic work by Todorov, The Conquest of America. So a particular portion actually talks about this sexual violence as a major tool for the Lusophone and Spanish-speaking early conquistadors. Okay, so sexuality, I mean the intimate encounter with women. And as I said in middle of the lectures, that actually they consider women as a major problem. Yeah, I did not mention that in the lecture. So the colonial enterprising always considered women a major threat because men they can kill. They can kill men. But if they have more women in colonized societies, though they keep on giving birth. Right? So because of the reproductivity part of women, so they actually annihilated women before they started annihilating men, for example, in Latin America and Africa. They did not kill men first. They killed women first because stop the production, stop children. We don't want more children. So there are a lot of societies, I mean the tribal communities who got kind of endangered by this time because they killed all the women then. So women were more threat to them because of the reproductive part of the story. Yeah.
One more doubt from a non-historian. You know, when the Portuguese came here, what happened to Malabar, Calicut in more particular, was the reenactment of the Crusades, which had ended only 200 years before Vasco da Gama came here. So that is very evident because the first person they met in Kapad was a Catalonian and an Algerian. Both of them asked this question, why the hell did you come here? Or some words to that effect, saying that devil brought you here or something. So that hatred, first instance, the hatred against the Christian presence was there. And this last scene in the crusade was fought out on the shores of Malabar. So this, and as we know, that all wars target women, maybe for reproductive reasons or maybe for dominance, whatever may be the reasons. So women are targeted in history, we find. Throughout history, they are the worst victims of any war. So there is nothing, I have a feeling that there's nothing, special about Tufat mentioning about this violence against women, because that was the accepted strategy, especially in the context of the crusade. And this is accepted, and here in Malabar, unfortunately, it was a very unequal battle, because the Muslims were not powerful enough to resist the Christian onslaught. That is number one observation. Number two is, Tufat was written about 20 years before Kunyali Marikar III was hanged. And Tufat says a lot of good things about Zamorin and his rule and all that. I was just guessing what would have, this is what is known as a virtual history, or what was so what would have happened if Tufat had been written 30 years before when it was written, or Kunyali Marikar had been hanged 20 years before he was hanged. Because the entire approach towards Zamorin and the ruling elite would have completely changed. Because there is no continuity in Zamorin's policy, you find. By the 1600, when the new Zamorin came, the Christian priests had influenced and intruded into the Zamorin's household. The Yuvaraja or the Arabad was converted, and the Tanur king was also secretly converted. And that is how they approached the issue of Kunjali America. So all this is, should be seen in the context of what is happening there. This is what I thought as a non-historian.
Okay. So I think the first one was not a question, so it was just an observation. And the second one is kind of a question, so I'll try to engage with that. So, and of course, I mean, there was a text, which was written in 1521 by another Zainuddin Maktoum I. So interestingly, what the absences you find is actually kind of interesting. The sense that, in Tahrir, that is a text which was written in 1521. All right? So, say something like 50 years before Tuhfat al-Mujahideen. So, and in that text, you don't find as much as you find in terms of the sexual violence in Tuhfat al-Mujahideen. So, that is one. And two, you also don't find anything about conversion. And of course, you have minimum references. So, we have to understand that, so Maktoum is writing this text in, say, some scholars would say late 50s, 70s, and I would rather argue that it was written in the early 50, 80. So you find this text was actually written when there was a large-scale conversion happening in Calicut and other places. And it's also about the last incident the Tuhfat is actually mentioning is happening in 1583, where Portuguese had a political and diplomatic alliance with then Zamori. So that really disturbed him, and that is why I argued elsewhere that is why he did not dedicate his book to the existing Zamorin. So instead he dedicated his book to Adil Shah of Bijapur. So he was kind of textually expressing his disappointment with the present Zamorin who gave the permission for conversion and other things which would definitely happen later on. So, and the question, what could have been happened? My counter question would be, could he have written that what he wrote 30 years before? So, situation was different in say, so 30 years before that means, 50, 40. So the political situation was very, very different then, and the political situation in the 50s, 80s was actually very, very, very different. And you also find a lot of things also happening in the Western Europe, when the Portuguese becoming very, very stronger by this time. So in 50-40, there was a comparatively weaker Portuguese, but in 50-80, there was a comparatively stronger Portuguese. So he was actually engaging with an extremely strong violative kind of a sexual empire. So I hope I came to your point. Yeah. Sol, done?
It's my great privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this memorable occasion of 5th Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar Endowment Lecture. On behalf of Calicut Heritage Forum, and on my behalf, I extend a big thank you to our honored speaker, Dr. Yasser Arafat, Assistant Professor at the University of Delhi, on the fascinating topic, the ocean between the empires, body, sexuality, and language in early modern Calicut. Going through his prolific publication profile, chair, presentations, and talks gives a glimpse of his enormous breadth of research interests in various topics. Many of these are really uncharted waters. We thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, which has given us new insight into never-ending and fascinating history of Calicut and, of course, Indian Ocean as a whole in an evidence-based manner. The recipient of this year's scholarship is Mr. Mohammed Shameen for his MPhil thesis, Network of Trade and Faith in Indian Ocean, in the Ocean, a study of the Muslims of medieval Malabar. He is a graduate of Calicut University and PG from Aligarh Muslim University and currently doing his PhD in JNU. Hearty congratulations to you, Shameen. We Indians of all faiths and belief systems are happy to spend astronomical amount of money on various celebrations and holidays. But the concept of endowment is still not that common. One of the earliest was the J.N. Tata Endowment for higher education of Indians, which has been helping students in 1892. India has 121 billionaires, 19 more than last year, making them the third largest group of ultra-rich after those from US and China, according to Forbes. But in the world's 100 largest philanthropic foundations list, I could not find a single Indian foundation. So it is in this context that we have to appreciate the generosity and social commitment of the family of Professor K.V. Krishna Ayyar in instituting this endowment to his glorious memory. And I sincerely thank Mr. Swaminathan and also to Mrs. Parvati Swaminathan in her absence, representing the Krishna Ayyar family. Professor MGS has always been our inspiration and guiding light, and I thank you for his continued advice, encouragement, and involvement. An event like this cannot happen overnight. It requires meticulous planning and a bird's eye for details. We have been fortunate enough to be led by our Secretary, Sri C.K. Ramyantran, IAS. I thank the press and the electronic media for their coverage of the event. And finally, a big thank you for all those who are present in this evening. Thank you.